Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Week 7 Waivers podcast. Normally here with Kevin Szafraniec, but he is on vacation, so we have an excellent fill-in, Dave Caban. How's it going?
Oh, doing well, Blair. It's good to be back with you here on the airwaves, especially on a day where we had a couple of big moves get made, a couple of interesting teams, and at one of our favorite positions.
Absolutely, yes. Ton of news to talk about today. We are hoping to answer some of your waiver questions, but we should start with some of these big wide receiver moves. I mean, I guess probably the biggest thing is the completion of the transition to Packers East in New York. Aaron Rodgers reunites with Devontae Adams. Yeah, how much does this move the needle for you in terms of the Jets offense and what you expect from them rest of the season?
Yeah, well, this one is kind of interesting in that this might be a move made a little bit too late for the Jets, but time will tell. I think that overall, if we're looking at this from a fantasy perspective, I actually think it should help this team a little bit. Whereas, you can make the case that this renders some of the players like Conklin and Alan Lazard perhaps useless for fantasy purposes. I think what we might see here is a slight uptick in production that you can get from the team across the board. As a result of that, I don't think that we're going to see much of this come at the cost of Garrett Wilson's production. We've seen him establish a very strong rapport there with Rodgers already. The game last night showed the connection that they have. I think you bring in Adams, it should add another dimension to this offense. Alan Lazard, the other thing here, Blair, is his connection with Rodgers and how he has been scoring isn't one that's predicated upon him seeing tremendous volume. It's been Hail Mary touchdowns in the end zone. Mm-hmm. It's been him kind of being the guy that scores at the end of a drive. And we know that Rodgers does trust Lazard. If anything, now we should see him having more opportunities for those quality type of looks. So the player that also needs to get factored into this analysis is Breece Hall, because we have seen a decent amount of his production come as a back out of the backfield. Now, I don't actually have a study on this that I can point to, but my suspicion is in the context of an offense like New York's, the addition of Adams does not significantly take away from the targets that we would see going to the running back. Of course, this might be something interesting for us to look into more at some point. I don't know if you've ever dug into any of this.
Yeah, I haven't really. Obviously adding a player like Adams to that team has to eat into the volume of all of the other receivers, and Breece Hall, count him among that group. Probably he's talented enough as a receiver to kind of command still a significant target share. I think Garrett Wilson is, like you said. I'm kind of skeptical about Lazard's talent, but clearly Rodgers likes him and has that connection. He had 7 targets last week, even with Wilson getting 10 and Breece Hall getting 6. So, it doesn't seem like those target levels are sustainable for all 3 of those guys. Do you think, is it a case where just like, Mike Williams 3 targets, Tyler Conklin 3 targets, these guys just are basically zeros, or do you think Lazard has to take a big chunk of his targets out?
I'm more inclined to say that we see a slight scaling back in Lazard. And it's the ancillary pieces that we see the larger, subtraction for. And we haven't talked about him yet, but Braylon Allen has seen, targets here and there. He might be the type of player too that's affected by this, and it hurts his prospects a little bit more, right? Because if you take away some of those receptions, some of that opportunity, it's harder to trust getting him into your lineup, where for a while it looked like he might be a guy that you could have in tandem with Hall as a potential option on rosters week to week.
Yeah, that's right. He had 2 targets as well in week 6. He's been, it looked like there might be, you would think this split would be kind of Hall gets all of the receiving work and then Braylon Allen kind of spells Hall on the ground, but
Yep.
Allen has been kind of a surprisingly good.
Yeah, he's actually had a target in every game, Blair.
Yeah.
And he's gone above 2 targets actually. He's been at 2 one time and then above 2 targets on weeks 2 and week 3. So it was definitely surprising usage for him.
Yeah. It looks like he only ran 4 routes according to the NFL Next Gen stats, which are a little bit different than what we're going to end up reporting in our tools tomorrow. But he's not getting on the field for those passing downs very often, but still able to earn those targets when he's out there. So that is kind of impressive. I guess the big beneficiary of this trade has to be Brock Bowers, though, right? I mean,
oh my gosh, yes.
Not like a first rounder in FFPC leagues next year.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to end up with that conversation for sure now. I mean, I think it already would have been in the works heading into this week. Even if you bring Adams back into the mix, Bowers has been really impressive. So if you look at the context now of this offense, I mean, there's just no way around it. All of the passing attacks should pretty much run through Bowers as the first option. Obviously, you still have Jacoby Myers there, and the other option being Trey Tucker. But if you looked at the target distribution so far, I mean, there's been such a disparity between Bowers and the other two that I think you're looking at a situation here now where you very realistically have Brock Bowers being the most heavily targeted tight end across the league at the end of the season, perhaps even the leader in expected points among tight ends. So, for sure the beneficiary. And then I guess my other note that I would have on the Raiders would be Trey Tucker might actually be a possibility that teams really looking for another wide receiver could go after. And I say that because he's quietly managed to put together, let me look it up here, but I believe he is at right around 9 points per game. If I could spell Tucker correctly here as I search for him. Yeah, so Tucker's actually at 8.3 points per game. It is possible with Adams gone now, we could see that number get up to around 8 or 10. Nothing moving the needle tremendously here, but for a waiver wire episode, if you are a team in need of wide receiver, he's an option that you can probably realistically get in a variety of formats.
Yeah, it's interesting. He's coming off really, the whole offense put up kind of a dud against Pittsburgh. I think the Steelers have maybe a better defense than people realize. But he had 2 targets, no catches, obviously no yards. He's been pretty productive in his pass games, though. 96 yards against the Panthers, which maybe that's the Panthers, so take that for whatever it's worth. But I guess, are you concerned at all that not having another receiver on the field like Adams hurts Tucker more because defenses are able to focus more on him or something like that?
I mean, I guess maybe I am to a certain standpoint, but I feel like the offsets that you might have, or it's probably offset by a slight uptick in targets. And honestly, I feel that, teams aren't going to be trying to take Trey Tucker out of the game. Right. Yeah. So I get your question, but, this offense will have to get passing production in some places, and Tucker, I think we'll get some as a result of that. But I'm not advocating that he's a high priority waiver wire ad here, right? I think you really summed up the key takeaway here is now this offense is really just Brock Bowers.
Yeah, for sure. Let's move on to the other big wide receiver trade news, which is the Browns sent Amari Cooper to the Bills in exchange for basically a 3rd round pick. It's a little more complicated than that, but this is an interesting move in a lot of ways because, we're kind of maybe now at the point where we're pretty skeptical about Amari Cooper as an NFL wide receiver. He wasn't really doing much with the Browns. How much does this impact the Bills' offense going forward?
So I actually have felt like there is more that could happen in Buffalo's offense. So I think in comparison to the Devontae Adams impact, where you see him removing some of the shares of that pie, I think in Buffalo, you're not going to have as much of an impact, right? If you look at the receivers on the team, Keon Coleman has found a couple of touchdowns, right? But he has not seen high volume. Khalil Shakir's volume has been as quite as high as suspected. And then even Dalton Kincaid, who maybe you could have made the case would be at like a 28% target share or something, on what might have been a lot of looks, hasn't really seen that many per game. And I'm in the Monday review tool here, Blair, and I have the target graph up, and I'm just dropping in, while we're talking here, I'm dropping in the three players that I just mentioned. And one of the interesting things is that, I don't see anybody on this team going beyond 7 targets a game. And, lots of times we have Kincaid maybe averaging somewhere around 6, Shakir maybe around 5, and Coleman around 4. So what I think is more likely to happen here is that though Amari Cooper might not be the receiver he once was, it might add a slightly different dimension into this offense. And I think we see the team pass a little bit more than we have in weeks past. As a result of that, I think this is actually a positive for the other wide receivers on the team, as it, I think, should give a little bit of a boost to this offense, which though, the team has been winning games, I think this offense is not what people were expecting that we would see, especially not for fantasy purposes heading into the year.
Yeah, that's true. It's been a very low volume offense. We had Dalton Kincaid leading the team in targets last week with 7. And NFL Next Gen also has him at 24 routes, which would be leading the team. So,
that is not great. That is not great.
So yeah, it's been a weird offense for the Bills, and I definitely think that, making this trade for Cooper at least signals an intention to try to increase the passing volume and kind of provide that spark in the passing game. We have a good question from a listener here, which is somewhat related. Jonathan is asking, how would you prioritize running backs this week? Sean Tucker, Ray Davis, Kamani Vidal. Ray Davis, of course, led the Bills in receiving yards this week.
That's perfect.
Tucker, I think, finished as the overall running back 1. I guess you could also maybe add Isaac Guerendo to the list of kind of interesting running back pickups who, with Jordan Mason out, might be the lead back in San Francisco, which is pretty interesting. So what are you thinking about the running back position this week?
This is a really, really tough one. I think to some extent it might come down to what you're looking to do with this waiver wire ad here. Sean Tucker is really interesting. And for anybody that wasn't too plugged in to the draft cycle when he was coming out, for a long time, he had been a pretty high prospect. I think it actually might even have been at the combine where they found he had like an underlying heart condition. And as a result of that, we saw his stock kind of fall. But he did have a pretty good profile coming out of school. And as a result of that, it might feel like you have this undrafted free agent coming in that has this one performance, which could be kind of a fluke. But given what we saw of his profile in college, had he not gone as an undrafted free agent, you'd probably think, okay, like this is the type of player that's just proven he does belong in the NFL. Now, you have this high-powered Buccaneers offense, which I wouldn't have been expected to be saying. Now, this was a game, though, that is probably not going to be indicative of what you see going forward. This was a game that really got away from the Saints, kind of turned into a bit of a boat race. But I do think that we've seen Bucky Irving have some success. Rachaad White, I do think, could lose his role to these two players, and you could see a bit of a split. So Sean Tucker, I definitely think, is a worthy waiver wire target. Behind him, Vidal is also interesting in that there's certainly a role for him there in a Chargers offense that wants to run the ball. He's also behind J.K. Dobbins, whose health is always something you have to worry about that. So I kind of put Ray Davis behind both of those guys. Now, Garendo, who you threw in too, I also think is an interesting name because you have a player there in San Francisco, a very interesting offense. Of course, we don't know exactly when we're going to get Christian McCaffrey, back on the field, what that could look like. And there also are players like Deebo Samuel who can step into roles there. So I am actually going to say that I could be wrong, but I'd take a swing for the fences here. And I'd say I'd probably go Tucker, Vidal, Garendo, Ray Davis.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, with the way Tucker looked, and he's been kind of a sneaky RotoViz favorite for a long time. I think he was probably one of Sean's most owned players last year or something, and guy he wrote up a lot. Yeah, he looked great. And I mean, it's interesting that even in this game, when Tucker puts up an RB1 performance, that Irving is still good enough to, he has 81 yards and a touchdown on the ground. I guess when I'm looking at this backfield, Rachaad White obviously didn't play, but when he's back, is there enough volume for Tucker to maintain this value? Because Irving still looks good. I don't know if this performance is enough to, give Tucker lasting value in an offense where, despite the fact that Rachaad White hasn't played well almost the entire year, they still keep giving him the ball.
Yep. I guess the one thing I'll throw in here, right, is I feel like with my running back waiver wire ads, I am looking to hit a home run. And I feel like my chances of the home run here are probably the best with Sean Tucker, but my chances of it being a wasted waiver wire ad that completely fizzles out are probably also the highest with him.
Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah, he does definitely have that home run ability. We saw that today, or not today, but this week. Yeah, Vidal had a nice catch and run that also was pretty impressive, kind of showing off his potential. Davis, obviously, with those 55 yards receiving, I think he had. And Garendo also had that long run. So there's a lot of big hitters out there on the waiver wire at running back. So it's kind of take your pick.
This is probably going to be one of the funnest weeks that there is on the waiver wire this season as far as running backs go, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I guess in terms of like long-term value, Gus Edwards was placed on IR, so that gives Vidal a little bit of a cushion there. We might see White and James Cook and maybe even Jordan Mason coming back in week 7, I think. So, definitely monitor all of those situations. We'll get to this tight end question next. Need a tight end this week: Hunter Henry, Schultz, or Likely?
Okay.
There.
So the first thing I'm gonna do here is pop into our weekly GLSP and take a look at these players. So I'm choosing. So we got Likely, Hunter Henry, and the third option. Who was it?
Dalton Schultz.
All right. So I can tell you that the GLSP really likes Isaiah Likely versus Tampa Bay. If I take a look at the average stat line of his comparable players that it's matching him to, they got around 6 targets, 4 receiving yards, 4 receptions, 47 yards, and 40% of them found the end zone. So this by and large gives him the best average projection of that group. Dalton Schultz this week, it does, unless I'm just missing him, it really is not a fan of him. Against Green Bay, an average of 6.1, Hunter Henry with an average of 7.8, Likely with an average of 11.4. Now, the one thing that kind of makes this a little bit difficult to digest here, Blair, is that we did see Mark Andrews get the most involved that he has been by and large in this past week. So I think that there's a couple of moving parts here also, because you have Hunter Henry in what will be Drake May's second game, right? If we look at what Hunter Henry got from Drake May over the last game here. And actually, I'm gonna have to ask you to filibuster for me here while I
Or Hunter
refresh
Henry,
a tool.
I can tell you, had 5
Okay.
targets, 3 catches, 41 yards, and a touchdown.
Yep.
You know, Demario Douglas got 9 targets, but other than that, Henry was the next most targeted player by Drake
Right.
May. So that is pretty interesting. May looked, at least compared to Brissett, like he could move the ball down the field, and that this was, a somewhat functional offense when he was in there. He's a little bit more mobile than Brissett. He took, I want to say, 4 sacks, which is, not great, but hopefully he'll get that down. Brissett took a lot of sacks, which was a big problem for New England. So I think May's an improvement in that regard as well. So I like the potential for Henry to get touchdowns in this offense, to continue to be one of May's favorite targets
Yep.
potentially. Likely obviously has that huge ceiling that we saw him put up in week 1, although there's a question with Andrews, and there's also, they've been kind of getting Charlie Kolar into the game a few weeks. That's a little bit weird, kind of Mark Andrews lookalike there. It
Yep.
always gets you a little bit excited for a second. And then Dalton Schultz, obviously with Nico Collins out, I think Schultz had maybe 8 targets or something. He did. He had 8 targets in their win against New England last week, which was more than Stephon Diggs, for instance. But maybe that's kind of a tough matchup against Green Bay that you would want to avoid this week.
Sure. Yeah, and actually, I'm looking at a graph here where I'm just looking at that group that we just talked about, their targets by week, and there's only been 2 weeks where Schultz wasn't the leader, and by a pretty decent margin. Likely and Hunter Henry have been fairly similar, but to kind of break this down here, I would expect going into this week that Henry, and I'm going to rule out Schultz, tough matchup, right? I'm going to go between Henry and Likely. Henry, I would say, has a better touchdown potential, given the fact that it looks like when this team is in position to score, he's going to be one of the top options there. Maybe you could say the same thing about Likely, but I'd also expect Henry to get more looks and be a more critical and pivotal piece of his offense. And I did do the GLSP exercise, but there is some context it doesn't have this week, and they weren't that far off. So I would go Hunter Henry. This is a good conundrum to have, though, I think, as like if you're in a team that's trying to just string things together week to week with tight end, it's a pretty good group of 3 to have to do that with.
For sure. I like that call. I like Henry in that matchup. I guess the one thing to consider is that maybe with Tampa Bay looking so explosive these last few weeks, they could push Baltimore to kind of put their foot on the gas a little more, and that game ends up scoring a lot of points and likely gets a touchdown. But I mean, you can't really count out a big likely game either. Henry obviously has multi-touchdown upside. Both of these guys can put up big games, and both of them, I think, could pretty easily put up duds, unfortunately. But it seems like Henry's more likely to get the volume in his offense than Likely is.
For sure. Yep.
All right. Let's see. We didn't talk about one running back who's kind of been one of the top performers over the last 2 weeks, who's maybe getting his backfield mate back in week 7. That's Tyrone Tracy, who's looked pretty amazing. I think he led the Giants in receiving yards this past week as well. When Devin Singletary comes back, is this simply going to be Tyrone Tracy's backfield anyway? Like, is he coming back to a backup role?
Well, okay. I will preface this by saying I don't know exactly who I saw posting this, but I believe I did see a couple of threads on Twitter of people that follow the Giants saying that the coaching staff just really likes Devin Singletary and they don't expect them to move off of him. All of that said, Tracy at this point in his career just looks like the guy that you have to go with. Like, Devin Singletary is still okay, but the type of things that we saw Tracy doing it just doesn't make sense to me that he wouldn't be, or at least still get another chance to kind of be the guy that is at the top of the running back food chain there. And that we see Singletary come back and there's that mix, but it's more of that 60-40 type of split, maybe 55-45 split that we've become accustomed to, and that you have Tracy getting the majority of looks there. So I think that of things I could have conviction about, this is pretty low on my list, but I still will be surprised if we don't see Tracy continue to get the first crack at things there.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, Singletary did actually play well before he got hurt, but the
He
things
did.
that
Yep.
Tracy has been able to do in tough matchups has been impressive. Sean made a point in one of his recent articles that basically arguing that the Giants would stick with Tracy because they are in so much need of positive narratives and positive stories to kind of energize the fan base and stuff. So
the one thing though that I probably should mention, not to cut you off there, and I don't have data, significant data here that I can use on Tracy, given that I don't have this week's advanced stats in here. But I will just point out that Devin Singletary also has been pretty good, an evasion rate of 21%, Blair, which is actually pretty good. Yards after contact, 2.6, which is kind of middle of the road. Yards before contact, 1.4. So that comes up to 3.9 yards per attempt, which we normally don't look at that much, but it's nice when you kind of split it up like that. 65% of his yards coming after contact. There's some pretty interesting things there. And when I take that quick kind of snapshot of the advanced running back stats, it does kind of show that, Singletary hasn't been a slouch, to your point.
Yeah.
Right. So if you do have a coaching staff that's interested in playing him, they're probably seeing, some of those things that we're looking at there reflected in the way that that he's been playing. But I will be pulling for Tracy.
Yeah, for sure. Just looking at like some of the EPA stats, it looks like they're both in the negative. Singletary more so because he has lost 2 fumbles, I believe.
Yep.
Main culprit there. But in terms of like rushing yards over expected, Singletary is at -10, Tracy's at +3. So there is a little bit of an efficiency gap where it seems like Tracy might actually be a little bit better of a runner here. Let's see. We have another question in the chat. How would you prioritize these players to pick up on waiver wires? Demario Douglas, Christian Watson, Tyler Algier, and Ty Chandler. So a little mix of positions here. We've got Douglas obviously coming off a pretty good game with Drake May. Watson having this long touchdown with Jordan Love. Algier actually out carrying Bijan Robinson in a game that got out of hand fairly quickly.
Yeah.
And then Chandler, that's kind of interesting after the one other news item we didn't touch on, which is that the Vikings have traded for Cam Akers. So how are you looking at these players?
This one is very tough. Obviously, there's going to be some team-specific context that would matter here too. But in a vacuum, let's say that I was starting a fantasy team today and I could only have one of these players. I think that I would actually put Algier at the top of the list, followed by Douglas and then Watson, then Chandler. What I am looking at here is I'm considering projectability in terms of if I'm able to play the player in my lineup weekly, and if when I do, I can expect a pretty decent return. And I think I put Algier at the top of that because, you mentioned the game over the weekend did kind of get out of hand, and we're probably not going to see Algier, outwork Robinson week to week, but there's definitely still that role there for him. I do think he's a pretty explosive player, a pretty good player. And this is a team now that has, they kind of didn't live up to the expectations that people had from those first 2 weeks, but they've turned it around since. Yeah. And I think it's a team that's trending in the right direction. And I like the fact that we're still seeing Algier get some work too as a receiver and as a rusher. Douglas, I think, is going to be one of May's targets going forward. I think we're going to see things pretty concentrated between Douglas and Hunter Henry. So I like that. Watson, you're going to get a couple of big games here and there, but it's hard to know when you're really going to use him. And then Chandler, as you mentioned, with Cam Akers coming into town in that Viking scheme, it's hard for me to know exactly what I can get. So that's kind of where my mind is at on those four.
Yeah, I think I would largely agree with that way of ordering them. The questioner did also note it's a PPR in case that changes how you're viewing those things. Maybe if you are weak at receiver, you would prioritize Douglas, who looks, based on just one game, like he's going to be earning some targets from Drake May. Maybe there's a chance that this game that Atlanta played against Carolina, where they ended up winning by 18, is not indicative of the kind of workload split we'll see in this backfield, as you kind of mentioned. But yeah, I mean, Algier has been looking good, even with Bijan. Even with Bijan.
Honestly,
he's just good.
He's good. Another team really that is looking for a back to, like, he's a player I'd be targeting in a trade if I were another franchise. But one interesting thing just to kind of linger on here is, I don't know how many people were watching the Patriots game over the weekend. I was, but you had Kayshon Boutte getting not only a couple of targets, but also punching in a touchdown. What if it turns out that all along he really is this player that he was early in his college career, and Drake May revives that? I would love to see it.
That would be that would be surprising. That would be cool to see.
It certainly would.
That on my 2024 bingo card for sure. Yeah, that's true. Boutte got that touchdown. He got, I just want to pull up his actual numbers. Yeah, 59 yards on 3 targets, 3 catches. Yeah, not huge volume, but he actually, it looks like, ran the most routes of any New England receiver. He did get the touchdown, second in yards. I mean, yeah, he was good for at least that 1 year in college.
He had that one very tremendous year. The other interesting thing too, not to make this a Patriots podcast here, but Ben Gretsch had lamented the drops of Jalen Polk, and I had been a bigger fan of Polk and coming out of school until I listened to some of the thoughts that Gretsch had, and then sure enough, gets a nice pass for May early in this game, drops it, could have made a couple of plays and didn't. So I think all of this is kind of circling back to the fact that it does look like is among the wide receivers, even though there's a couple of different names you could toss around. I think Douglas is still at the top of it.
Yeah. But I mean, to your point about Boutte, it does look like there's a lot of uncertainty here, and it's kind of wide open. So yeah, from that perspective, it makes sense to prioritize Algier, who we know is good and is putting up, these rushing yards. Even when Bijan has a good game, still Algier is productive. So yeah. Speaking of other wide receivers who we're hoping will maybe revive some early career production, the Chiefs are hoping to get a Rashee Rice replacement from Juju Smith-Schuster, former Patriot. Do you think that can happen, or are you looking to, well, I mean, Xavier Worthy's not on anybody's waiver wire, but Juju might be.
So
adding, I guess, is the
I cannot believe, Blair, that we have now come back to a discussion about Juju Smith-Schuster at this point in time in the context in which we are. I think Juju's an intriguing option. The problem is you're not going to get out of him that type of week-to-week expectation that you would have with Rice, where he's going to be a focal point in the offense. At this point, the talent delta between Rice and Juju, I think, is pretty vast. Mm-hmm. Also, on top of that, we've seen decent efficiency and, pretty high quality targets for Juju when he's gotten them. But the reality is, even if we do see an uptick in targets, that efficiency is probably going to come down, right? There's definitely some noise in there. And then on top of that, this is the Chiefs offense, but this isn't the Chiefs offense that we've known for a while. Right. So even if you have Juju kind of ascending into this Rashee Rice role, I don't think it's nearly what it used to be. Could he be a fantasy relevant player? Yeah, he probably will be. But honestly, I think if you go after him, unless you're in dire needs of receiver, you're probably still not going to be putting him in your lineup week to week.
Right. Yeah, right. We saw, let's see, he had 8 targets, 7 catches, 130 yards in week 5, kind of his first week without Rashee Rice, to see what we would get. So an impressive start, but certainly uh at least you want to see more of him doing this before you're going to feel confident that this is, I mean, obviously you can't expect 130 yards a game
Right.
from Juju, but to expect him to even be able to put up uh usable fantasy weeks.
And of course, I should probably throw out the fact here that I have an odd relationship with Juju Smith-Schuster in that I was harder on him than I should have been in the start of his career. I discounted the precociousness that he showed at USC. Then I got completely on board with Juju. And right around when I got completely on board with Juju was when Antonio Brown left Pittsburgh and then Juju didn't live up to expectations.
Yeah.
Right. So I have been hurt a number of times by Juju Smith-Schuster from going back to the well too many times. But I think that this time I'm justified in not trying to go back to the well.
Yeah, I think that's right. Xavier Worthy is a guy that I drafted a ton of in best ball and redraft. Does Juju being here at least kind of put a damper on Worthy's kind of outlook for his rookie season?
Well, I think the problem for Worthy has been it didn't look like he was going to get into that high volume type of role, right?
Yeah.
The production that we've seen from him has come from them, and albeit their creative ways of getting him involved, rushing touchdowns, getting handoffs to him. But I don't know if we were really going to see Worthy get to the point where he was consistently getting 7, 8 targets a game. I think if he were, the opportunity for that to manifest already would have come. So I guess in some way, the fact that Juju is there makes it look like he's preventing that ceiling, Worthy from reaching a ceiling. But I think the reality is that his opportunity to do that was already passed, and it's not predicated upon Juju being there. It's just that it doesn't look like he's fitting into that offense in a way that's how they're going to use him.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. He had 6 targets in week 5, Juju with the 8, obviously leading the way, but it might be that just the way they're using Worthy kind of caps his target potential around that kind of 6 mark. And
right. And I mean, it's a decent total, but I think for what a lot of us were hoping heading into the year and what you would still need for him to really kind of be pushing into the sphere that you were hoping for, you would need more. Especially given that their best receiver is out and missing time, and we didn't see him really get to, usurp some of that role.
Right. All right, another question here from someone looking to pick up either Kamani Vidal or Demario Douglas. Would you drop Zach Charbonnet and or Braylon Allen for either of those guys?
So I guess this is how I would answer this, right? I'm assuming that if you're considering this, you're probably in need of a running back. I'll answer this more globally. How I am always doing things with my running backs, and I'm assuming that people are viewing the show are kind of running their teams fairly similarly. I am just trying to get the one that could end up being that guy that could make or break things for my team. Yeah. At this point, it's not looking like it's going to be Charbonnet, and it's probably not going to be Allen. So I think that I would be okay with dropping either of those guys to see what happens with Vidal. Right. And then Douglas, in this case, I'm assuming we're talking about DeMario, at which point, if you need the extra players at running back, I don't think I would, because Douglas probably isn't going to be able to, even if he hits, he's not going to move the needle for your team in the way that Vidal would.
Right. Yeah, right. I would agree. This is a very team specific kind of question, but it does look like Vidal might have more of that kind of explosive upside than Charbonnet, at least as long as Kenneth Walker is healthy. Braylon Allen looks really promising, has looked really promising. He kind of is hampered by the fact that Breece Hall is really good and by the fact that the Jets are so dysfunctional. So, Yeah, I might. Yeah, I think I'd probably agree that I might drop one of those guys for Vidal. Who would you probably prefer to keep between Charbonnet and Allen?
Kind of a tough one here. I think what I have to, the way that I would answer that is if one of them were to get the role, which guy do I think ends up doing better if they do get the role?
Mm-hmm.
Now it's kind of difficult because we did see Charbonnet have a really good performance when he had the opportunity this year, and also Kenneth Walker has been really solid.
Yeah.
But it does look like Allen might have a little bit of an X factor, right? And we got kind of hyped up on him at the end of the draft cycle, so it's going to be hard for me not to say him. And in fact, I think I'm going to. This is one though where I think it's going to be hard for us to point to any specific statistic or something like that, as a lot of it's just kind of the hypothetical of what could happen if they got the role.
Right. Yeah, I would agree. I think it's easier to say drop Charbonnet for Vidal than to drop Braylon Allen. I think for me, Allen looks pretty explosive. He looks like if Hall went down, I mean, you're talking about potential running back one rest of season. And
yeah, sure. I think
Charbonnet as well, actually, if Walker.
Yeah,
goes, but
you make a good point though, Blair, in that Charbonnet is a little bit more of a known entity at this point, and while we have a little bit more information on what it looks like if he goes in for Kenneth Allen, whereas with Braylon Allen, it's possible he is really, really good, and we would get to see that. Whereas at this point, we know Charbonnet might be serviceable, but he's probably not really, really good.
Yeah. Not a question here. Similar situation. Both starting to lose their secondary role as well, since Walker's getting so many targets. Yeah. Even in games where Seattle has to play a kind of pace up game, still you see Walker really central part of that passing game, which I think is kind of a nice revelation after he was coming out of college, averaging like, I don't know, he probably had like single digit catches most seasons in college. Yeah.
And I love when this happens, because there's lots of times where I feel like players, especially in certain systems, never get to show what they can do as a receiver. And there's this knock on them that, they can't catch and stuff. It's like, come on, these are some of the best athletes in the world. Like, you don't think if you give them the opportunity to practice a little bit and we get them, into catchable situations that they can't catch the ball and make a play, like, come on. Right.
Yeah, the kind of body control and athleticism it takes to be an NFL running back probably gives you the skill you need to catch a football.
Right.
Well enough. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Anything else we need to touch on before we get out of here? Thanks everyone for all your questions. And if you have any last minute ones, get them in now.
Can I ask a question, Blair?
Definitely.
Trey Benson.
Yeah.
We know I was trying to make him a thing heading into the season. Now, James Conner looks like is dealing with an ankle injury. And I have actually been at the point where I'm wondering on some of my rosters if I'm doing myself a disservice by kind of clogging a spot, just holding out hope for Trey Benson. Should I keep holding out hope for Trey Benson? Same thing could be said practically for Jalen Wright. These are two guys I've been holding on to. Are we at that point where I can start thinking about letting them go?
Oh man, yeah, Jalen Wright, Trey Benson. I'm still holding out hope for both of these guys.
Okay.
Obviously, Jalen Wright coming off the bye, we didn't get to see him last week, but I thought looked really explosive, better than Mostert. So it wouldn't surprise me to see him at least become the second running back in Miami, and if Tua is back and that offense can kind of turn things around, I think that's a really valuable role. In terms of Benson, I'm still optimistic. If it looks like Connor is going to miss some time or something, kind of tough to say. They did still give some carries to DeMarcado in week 6, but I'm not yet ready to give up hope on Benson. I think he was the more effective runner.
All right.
Yeah. I'm still holding out hope for both of those.
All right. Guys. That's what I wanted to hear. And I think, also the thing to keep in mind here is probably the thesis that I had about these guys. We still haven't really reached the point where that would have passed.
Yeah.
Right. So I think we got one more question here that came in.
We have. I'm going to get Vidal, but in case I don't get him, would drop Charbonnet for Ray Davis as well. So is Ray Davis the sort of player you drop for Vidal? Davis played obviously a lot with James Cook out, but Cook probably isn't going to miss a ton of time.
Right.
However, Davis also played really well. Maybe when Cook comes back, it's not as clear that it's Cook's backfield. I don't know.
Oh, wow. It is interesting that there's always a lot of talk of like how good James Cook actually is. And this year he's been able to put together the fantasy points, but I do think that there's a conversation open to, if you give those looks to somebody else, are they more productive? Which I think is fair. So are you saying then, Blair, I think is that your way of saying that you would go for Davis over Charbonnet?
I probably would go for Davis over Charbonnet. And it's kind of like this to what you said, where Charbonnet is like a known entity. We saw him be fairly productive in those games without Walker, but still not at the level where Walker is, and not probably pulling away with that job as compellingly as it looked like Ray Davis might. Because, I mean, I think he had probably 150 scrimmage yards against or whoever the Jets they played.
And if Amari Cooper doesn't work out, they might need to start having Ray Davis play the role of their wide receiver one another week.
That's right. Oh man, I wanted to ask in relation to the Cooper stuff, like what is going on with Cleveland's offense now?
Have they just given up? Or it's either that or they're just thinking Nick Chubb is coming back and they're just gonna run Nick Chubb into literally into the ground to end his career, and they've just given up. I don't know.
Is there a receiver you want to own in Cleveland now?
I actually, and this was another kind of turnaround for me. Jerry Jeudy, I have historically been pretty down on.
Yeah.
I trashed him in some of the write-ups that I did this year. But once the season started, I actually found him a really useful player to have on my rosters. And I think now I definitely do. I don't think you're ever going to get those ceiling games with him, but in the stretch of the bye weeks and injuries, I don't have any problem actually swapping in Jerry Jeudy. And the other thing that I've noticed is he has a lot of defenses that he matches up with pretty nicely in the passing game matchup rater, just as a function of where he runs his routes from on the field and kind of the uniques and specifics of it. So I've been pretty surprised with how that has worked out for him there in Cleveland. In the games I've put him in, he's not lighting the world on fire, but he's still getting me 10, 12 points a couple of weeks. So I actually do have a little bit of interest in Jerry Jeudy for a very specific type of purpose.
Yeah. Yeah, he's got a couple games this season with like 72, 73 yards, back-to-back games with only 3 targets and 1 catch in his last 2 weeks. So recent play hasn't been great, but if with no Cooper there, I mean, I guess he's the guy.
He's the alpha.
Yeah, he's going to be the one who's getting most of the targets. Just looking, David Njoku.
Of course, Njoku's been out for a while too, which might shift things a little bit. But I don't know. At this point in the year, right, when you're looking for wide receivers and just players they can contribute, Jerry Jeudy's probably towards the top of the list.
Right. All right. With that, I think we will call it a night. Thanks everyone for tuning in, for getting in those questions. We did have one other question come in right at the last second. Charb is the one to drop of these 4 handcuffs: Ray Davis, Algier, Braylon Allen. Yeah. So of these 4, definitely Charbonnet is the one to drop.
Yes. There's absolutely no dropping of Algier. Like that can't even be considered.
All right. Awesome. Well, thanks again, guys, and make sure to rate and review the podcast and like and subscribe to the channel. I think you can still get a discount to a RotoViz subscription using the code RVRadio 2024, I believe.
That is accurate. Yep.
There you go. Excellent. And we've still got a lot of good stuff going on there. Obviously, Kevin's waiver article, which formed the basis for many of our discussions tonight, and Dave's got his Going Deep article. I've got the wrong read. Sean's Zero RB Universe is coming. Ton of great stuff to look out for. So definitely get on that. if you're not already. And with that, we will talk to you next time.